American Sign Language, also known as ASL, is the most common sign language that is used within deaf communities in the United States. ASL is a natural language just like any spoken language such as English or Spanish is. It is picked up naturally by children and utilized among adults just like any other language in the world. It has been proven through research that if deaf infants are exposed to ASL from birth, they will reach the same milestones during their language development as hearing infants and at the same times. This shows that language skills and language comprehension and development is the same for a child that grows up with ASL as their first language as it is for a kid that grows up with English or any other spoken language as their first language. ASL was recognized officially as a language by linguistic experts in the 1960s. Ever since, ASL has been studied along with the other languages of the world to try to understand the nature of human language. One way that ASL is unique from spoken languages is that it is more simultaneous than spoken English. The grammatical structure of ASL allows more information to be conveyed at the same time. A single verb can show who's doing the action, who's receiving it, whether the action is completed or ongoing, and if it happens one time or regularly. In addition, facial expressions can be utilized to add extra details surrounding the action. For example, if a person wanted to convey that two people were walking somewhere, they wouldn't have to sign two people and then walking separately. The signs are blended into one gesture like this. That same gesture can also include facial expressions that show emotions relating to the action, or you can also change the speed of the walking to be faster or slower or other things related to that. This blending of different ideas and meanings into one set of signs without having to individually explain each section is unique to ASL. Natural languages such as English, ASL, and any other language arise and spread spontaneously throughout civilization because they are used by people organically to communicate and do necessary functions. Artificial, manufactured communication systems such as signed exact English and Morse code, on the other hand, usually have to be taught. They aren't learned naturally or easily and require many hours of practice. These artificial systems don't follow the universal structural principles of both spoken and signed natural languages, and children don't pick them up easily or naturally. The result of this is that these systems tend to only be used in the classroom and not in the wider cultural community. Signed exact English, also known as C, is one of these manufactured languages. The purpose of C is to mimic spoken English. Therefore, every word that would be present in a written and spoken sentence is signed when communicating. This means that communicating with C is very time-consuming and would be very difficult for deaf people to use all the time because it takes much more time to communicate one idea. Pidgin Sign Language, also known as PSE, is a combination of ASL and C. This middle language is often used in educational settings to help deaf students' development of spoken and written English skills. The vocabulary is drawn from ASL, but the grammatical structure follows the English word order. Prepositions and other words that do not carry information are usually dropped. The word endings of English are also dropped. This allows the signer to easily speak while signing since it is possible to keep pace with spoken English. PSE is simpler to learn than ASL or C because one does not need to include all of the English word endings, neither does one have to master the complex structure or idioms of traditional ASL. Here's an example of the difference between the three languages. If you wanted to say that you were going to the store, in ASL you would sign store and then going. In PSE, the grammatical pattern follows the patterns of English, so first you would say going and then store. In C, however, you would sign I am going to the store, so each word is signed individually. As you can see from this demonstration, communicating the same idea in all three of these different languages, in C it takes a great deal longer of time to communicate one idea versus in ASL or PSE, which is why ASL is preferred by a lot of deaf signers. While the Black deaf community maintains that there is no official Black sign language, there is, however, a distinctly Black way of signing that is used by Black deaf people within their own community. The Black deaf version of signing can best be compared to a dialect. The spoken dialect of English called African American English, also known as AAE, has its own properties according to how words are pronounced, how verbs are used, differing vocabulary, and other properties. Similar to AAE, Black ASL behaves like a dialect of ASL in that it has its own unique properties that traditional ASL does not have. One example of this is in its vocabulary. Black ASL has different signs for cotton, tobacco, whites, tractor, cornbread, biscuits, and peanuts that are still extensively used today. These signs are not just a regional variation from the South, however. Many Southern white deaf people do not use or even know of these signs that are used in Black ASL. Therefore, these signs can be classified as originating from and indigenous to the Black deaf community. Signs that are unique to Black ASL are also different in their feeling and expression. The signs indigenous to the Black deaf community tend to be more colorful and demonstrative with nonverbal expressions and body language. Black ASL also tends to have more mouthing while signing, more two-handed signs than one-handed signs, more repetition. It tends to sign higher and more on the forehead, and to use a larger signing space. Here are a couple of signs that most white deaf signers would sign with one hand and most Black deaf signers would sign with two. For example, the sign deer is signed like this with one hand and like this with two hands. Another example of this is the sign for have. With one hand it would be like this, and with two hands it would be like this. The sign language that was used by the people in the Plains Indians tribes was called Plains Sign Talk, or PST. PST is structured a little differently than ASL stylistically, grammatically, and in its vocabulary. In the videos showing Crow Sign Language, a form of PST, one of the things I noticed was that facial expressions are used far less to communicate meaning than they are in ASL. For example, in ASL, one signals with their eyebrows whether a question is a yes-no question or a where, what, or why question. I also noticed that the signing space is different in PST. The signing space is typically circular and can be in front or completely surrounding the person who's signing or anything else similar to that. The location of the circular signing space that is used at any one time can be used to represent a larger location such as a circular field or teepee. The smaller objects, like people, other objects, etc., that the signer is discussing can be localized in it by indicating where they are and what they are. In addition, another thing I noticed that is different between ASL and PST is the sign vocabulary. In PST, a lot of the signs seem to be more relevant to reservation living and nature than they are in ASL. For example, in ASL, the sign for hunting is denoted by guns like this, but in PST it's denoted by a bow and arrow like this. Another thing that I would like to mention about PST culturally is that the role of PST in the Plains Indians tribes was very different than how ASL is used today in America. In our modern age, the vast majority of Americans don't know any ASL at all. In the Plains Indians tribes, however, everyone in their communities knew PST and used it on a regular basis while speaking. They also used it to communicate in loud environments such as powwows when no one could hear speech because of the loud drum beats. In addition, PST was universally known by all tribes from southern Canada to Texas, even when spoken languages differed. This allowed sign language to be a bridge between the different groups to ensure mutual understanding when spoken language wouldn't suffice. I have learned a lot in the making of this project. One thing I have learned about ASL is that it has been scientifically proven through lots of research to be a natural language just like every other spoken language in the world, in the way it is picked up naturally by children as they grow up, and also in the way ASL adapts and changes in its vocabulary and structure through the different time periods, just as every other spoken language has. In addition, another thing that I have learned is that Black ASL is not considered to be its own separate language from ASL, but is in fact more of a dialect of ASL. Black ASL has its own distinct properties according to how words are pronounced, how verbs are used, and has its own unique vocabulary words, just like AAE, a dialect of spoken English, does. Finally, the last major conclusion I have made through learning about these topics is on comparing the role of PST in Plains Indians tribes to the role of ASL in America. Our mainstream society would be so much more accessible and open to the deaf community if ASL was treated today like PST was in the Plains Indians tribes. Everyone in the Plains Indians tribes knew PST and used it on a daily basis while speaking. This must have made it so that no deaf person was ever unintentionally excluded from anything in their community. Being deaf can only be a so-called disability if our society lets it be so by not making the world more accessible. I hope that in the future we try to use this history of PST in the Plains Indians tribes as an example of what could be in our society in the future if we put in the work.